Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today's podcast, I'm going to talk about the G7 summit, which our Prime Minister attended over the weekend. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was showing off his privilege while he jet set over to London for this international summit. Unlike the lowly Canadians that Trudeau rules over, he doesn't have to worry about going into mandatory detention upon his return to Canada. Mandatory detention, that's what his loving media euphemistically refer to as hotel quarantine. It's kind of like a hotel, except for if you leave, you get fined and you could go to jail. Now, Trudeau doesn't have to worry about that. He doesn't have to worry about catching COVID-19 at one of these facilities or the prohibited cost that this would add to his trip. He doesn't have to worry about missing work or losing pay. And apparently he doesn't have to follow the same social distancing rules as the rest of us. Rules are for the little people, right? Well, first, Trudeau played up the whole wearing a mask thing, just like his finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, did the week before. He was awkwardly the only G7 leader to wear a mask while also being outside, while also social distancing. It's all a bit much, even for the king of virtue signaling himself. I appreciated this post by U.S. Congressman Dan Crenshaw and his take. He says, "Hey Alexa, show me a group of irrational people who are afraid to get each other sick even after being vaccinated." And then Alexa shows him this weird G7 promotional video where UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is doing this weird new handshake, greeting the leaders of each of the world's most powerful nations alongside their spouses. And you can see Trudeau, he is the only one wearing a mask. So why is Trudeau wearing a mask? Is it because he's irrational, as Dan Crenshaw suggests? Or is it because he's playing up the whole security theater optics around COVID? Perhaps it's because Trudeau is the only G7 leader not to be fully vaccinated, which in and of itself is pretty embarrassing, probably even more embarrassing than Trudeau wearing a mask outside while socially distancing. Well, I'm going to say this was all security theater because later, after the official videographer had left, Trudeau and company were spotted boozing it up. None of them were wearing masks, none of them were social distancing, and they were all breaking Canadian rules about the maximum number of people allowed at a social gathering. Oops. We know that if this was happening at home, if this was Ontario Premier Doug Ford, the media would have absolutely roasted him for it, just like they roasted Alberta Premier Jason Kenney last week because, he was caught sitting outside at a table, looks like he was socially distancing, doing a work meeting with his colleagues. Well, of course, the media have different standards for conservatives. Well, luckily for Trudeau, the media don't play that kind of role of judge and jury, and they just kind of let it slide because, after all, Trudeau is a Liberal. And when it comes to embarrassment for Canada and our hapless Prime Minister, it doesn't stop here. I want to point your attention to this interesting story that came out in Bloomberg because it gives us a little window into some of the dynamics that are happening at this summit. So here's the headline. It says, "With Merkel gone, Canada's Trudeau wants to be Dean of the G7." So the article is about how German Chancellor Angela Merkel is stepping down from politics. She won't be running for re-election. That leaves Canada's Justin Trudeau as the most senior of all the leaders. Senior just meaning that he has been the leader for the longest. Trudeau's been in office since 2015, giving him about 6 years as leader. And that is the longest of the pack right now. Well, unfortunately, according to this Bloomberg story, while Trudeau is trying to position himself as the new elder statesman, no one is seeing him that way, and no one is seeing him in that role the same way that they did see the German chancellor. Just because Trudeau has been the prime minister for longest doesn't mean that he's the most experienced. He's actually probably still the least experienced. Joe Biden, who was a senator for decades, served as vice president under Barack Obama. You have Boris Johnson, who's the UK prime minister, who before becoming prime minister was the mayor of London. So most of these people have actually had long-standing careers where they've accomplished stuff. Trudeau in his life before being a politician didn't really do much. We know that he was a bouncer at a nightclub. He was a whitewater rafting instructor. He taught at a private school for a couple of years. He didn't really have a career. He didn't really do much. And so while most of these other world leaders earned their reputation, Trudeau just kind of inherited his. And that might be good enough for a minority of Canadians, but it doesn't seem to cut it in these global elite circles. So let me read from this Bloomberg report. It says, "In the company of such heavyweights, the leader of the smallest post G7 economy cuts a marginal figure in spite of efforts to be the new dean, as he became known among the Canadian delegation at this week's summit. So I'm just going to say this is a little embarrassing. In other words, Trudeau's comms staff at this summit is trying to spin to the media that Trudeau is the elder statesman, he is the leader of the pack, and his own entourage started calling him Dean. But it seems from reading this article that their efforts have failed, and Trudeau is still only seen as a marginal figure. It said it right there. He's a marginal figure. Ouch. And it gets worse for Trudeau. The article goes on to say, as Brexit flared up on the sidelines of the gathering, Trudeau offered his services as a mediator. Canadian officials say the 49-year-old Prime Minister in power since 2015 genuinely believes that he can help the UK and the European Union find a solution to their trade dispute. So he has this very high opinion of himself, but Bloomberg goes on to report, no one has taken him up on the offer, it seems, even as Brexit tensions boil over the last days of the summit. So again, nobody really sees Trudeau as a useful figure in all of this, despite Trudeau's own grandiosity. And we are told that this happened. So it says, the host, Boris Johnson, did, however, tap him to lead a high-stakes discussion on China and how to counter its growing economic and strategic might. A Canadian official said it was in recognition of his experience. Trudeau certainly has experienced the wrath of Beijing. So again, I'm not sure that Trudeau's experience is the kind that his spinner should be boasting about, because when it comes to China, Trudeau's Canada is really more of a cautionary tale. And the Bloomberg report certainly alludes to that, saying that some Canadian official was praising Trudeau, saying that this was in recognition of his experience. And the reporter kind of pushes back, saying that Trudeau's only experienced the wrath of Beijing. So what exactly has Trudeau accomplished when it comes to China? So we have the high-stake fugitive situation, the two Michaels who were basically arbitrarily arrested in retaliation to the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou when she landed in Vancouver. The two Michaels are being held in inhumane conditions, and Trudeau doesn't really seem to know what to do. A group of senior Liberals put out an open letter urging Trudeau to essentially participate in a prisoner's swap. Doesn't seem like Trudeau's going to do that, but he hasn't really done anything to help save these two Michaels. Trudeau was also caught allowing the Chinese Communist military to be stationed in Canada, where they were doing winterized military training. Can you imagine that? And even when this news became public, Trudeau's officials actually pushed back and they defended this project, they defended the move, stating that rolling it back could jeopardize relationship with China and it could offend China and therefore worsen the feud with Canada and China over Meng and the two Michaels. Look, if I was looking for advice on how to deal with China, an adversarial country, a communist dictatorship, a country that's committing genocide and spying on the world, I certainly wouldn't go to the guy who once said this.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China. Because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fast as we need to start investing in solar.
And despite all this, Trudeau still has a very high opinion of himself. It really shone through during a press conference that Trudeau was giving at the end of the G7 summit. Watch this exchange where a friendly BBC reporter asked Trudeau a question about what exactly he has accomplished at this summit. I'm going to walk you through this clip because there's quite a bit to unpack. So first, here's the question, which is definitely a little bit snarky, but just watch how Trudeau reacts.
The G7 in Cornwall risks being forgotten in the way that most G7 summits are forgotten. Beyond the beach and the barbecue and the royal banquet, what do you think the world ought to remember from this summit that will make a real difference?
So you can tell he is annoyed. He's used to the subservient reporters in the Canadian Press Gallery, most of whom are on his payroll, and he's annoyed with the tone of this reporter's question. Keep in mind, the question itself is still a softball. He's basically saying, hey, Trudeau, tell us what you've accomplished, which is an easy question for a politician to answer. That's exactly the kind of question they want to get. But Trudeau is still annoyed that anyone would even suggest or hint at the idea that these G7 meetings weren't the most important thing on planet Earth. So watch what Trudeau says.
I can't help but think back to our G7 summit in Charlevoix that was made famous from a tweet from an airplane.
Okay, so first Trudeau mentions the summit, the G7 summit that was held in Canada and Quebec a few years ago. And who could forget that summit? The big news coming out of that conference was the feud between Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau. Basically, what happened was that Trump showed up just after he had announced a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and another 10% tariff on Canadian aluminum. Well, apparently Trudeau didn't even bring up these tariffs in person, but then after Trump left, he held a press conference where he did talk about it. So that led to Trump tweeting about it, and that was what Justin Trudeau was referring to. Trump left the G7 summit early. He was heading to South Korea, where he was about to facilitate an historic meeting between North Korean and South Korean officials, so kind of heading off to more important business, while Trudeau was left presiding over this G7 summit, which frankly no one even really cares about. And Trump was mad that Trudeau was saying these things behind his back. So Trump said this: PM Justin Trudeau of Canada acted so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left saying that US tariffs were kind of insulting and he would not be pushed around. Very dishonest and weak. Our tariffs are in response to his of 270% on dairy. So those are fighting words, and things only got worse for Justin Trudeau because he was then caught on a hot mic bashing Donald Trump, basically acting like a mean girl in a high school cafeteria, gossiping about Trump to the other world leaders. So if anything, it was Trudeau's immature behavior that derailed the summit for Canada, took over the news cycle, not so much Trump's tweets. But not in Trudeau's mind. To him, he is this super serious world leader who is out there saving the world. Let's go back to this clip where Trudeau tells us all about how important he is.
But what actually resulted in that G7 in Charlevoix was a commitment that saw millions, if not actually billions of dollars flowing to girls' education around the world. Investments that have made a real and tangible difference in the lives of thousands upon thousands of women and girls in countries around the world. We move forward on an oceans charter to fight plastics in the oceans that have actually had real impacts. We move forward on many partnerships that, didn't make the headlines the next day, but has been part of a steady working effort by G7 members to have a positive impact on the world. And I don't know what you will all be writing about tomorrow, but I can tell you the work we got done here today at a time where the G7 is more united than ever before, more focused on the responsibility we wield collectively as some of the world's leading economies, not just to our own citizens, but to citizens around the world, during a time of dueling crises of the pandemic and climate change. The impacts of this G7 will be felt long after the newspapers you write for will have been used to wrap fish.
So that's just Trudeau being Trudeau. He's so arrogant. And he goes on and on and on about how important he is, how there's these dual crises of COVID and climate change. But don't worry, gang, Trudeau is on it and he's going to save the planet. And he took that weird shot at journalists because I guess he doesn't like the headlines that come out of these G7 conferences. And he kind of just concludes by saying that his legacy will be long lasting while the newspaper headlines sort of fade. And he took a weird shot saying that newspapers are only good for wrapping fish. And then he has this little smirk at the end because he's so proud of himself for having that really lame joke. Look, it looks to me like Trudeau is just compensating here. He's trying to emphasize how important and how successful he is because basically the opposite is true. Once again, Trudeau misses the mark. He ends up sort of embarrassing himself, sort of embarrassing Canada on the world stage. And once again, Trudeau is either too arrogant or just too naive to even notice. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this has been The Candice Malcolm Show.